Welcome to another part of The Floor. Today we're going to be talking about dragon response missions, kind of a key part of the new Living World format for this multi-chapter finale at the end of Icebrood Saga. I talked a lot about this in my production yesterday, and you guys have some great responses. There's a few other little topics in here too that were mentioned in the video I want to address. The footage in the background will just be more of my experience of the patch from that early day. I've got so much footage, and I have no idea how to show it to you all, so we'll just get through what we can. I've even got a ton of footage now as well of the previous release too, which now has voice acting. So Jormag Rising I played through and really tried to get more to grips with. That patch I'd hardly touched. Can you believe I hadn't done the North meta, like, at all, really? Quite shameful, honestly. So I spent ages in open world last night playing that. I think I did it 7 times in one day, trying to find some kind of interesting build. You know, I think one of my big problems with Guild Wars 2 at the moment, and one of the big problems I've had with the Icebrood Saga, isn't necessarily the saga itself. It's just that I'm so utterly burned out from the open world experience. You know, maybe during Season 4, I was still a little bit receptive to Istan, which by all accounts was pretty good. And I was pretty receptive to Shatterer 2 in Jahai Bluffs, and I was pretty receptive to the Gandara Assault, even though, you know, that one in particular was rather poor, honestly. I was still kind of getting something out of those open world events. Now, I just feel so hollow and numb and bored in the open world doing that kind of stuff. And along comes a lot of the Icebrood Saga maps, which have good open world metas. You know, they've all been well made. Drakkar was great. Drizzlewood lives and breathes for it, and it's just not clicking for me. Most of my time yesterday was trying to find new builds, because I feel like if I can find at least some interesting builds that feel vaguely effective, maybe there'll be some enjoyment there, you know? So I went back to old classics I haven't given a shot or played at all, really, since Path of Fire came out. Like Starfelly, like try to get absolutely every point of power I can on a Starfelly and see if I can find it fun, see if Pyroclastic Blast is worth the annoyance of playing Weaver, playing various Scourge versions to spam Barrier on people, see if that's fun to feel like supporting people. Playing a Might bot build, because on my time as a Starfelly, I realized no one was giving proper Might, and now that annoyed me, so maybe that would be a fun build to play. Playing Hollow, playing Mirage, playing Firebrand, playing anything I can to sort of get an interesting gameplay experience. And I don't think I really succeeded in the end. The PvE gameplay is just too empty to me, especially after you've played some of the more dynamic stuff in World vs. World, in raiding, and especially in PvP. So I don't know. The other side of the coin, obviously, is to become invested in the rewards again. And hey, at least for that collector's mentality, there is a lot to do in the Icebrood Saga. There are a lot of new weapon sets and armor pieces to go for, and of course this otter infusion. So hopefully that will keep me tidied over for a bit. Anyway, so let's get into your comments. That's what this is really about. And opening here with the Aviency, who is not impressed with the quality of the release. And I think what they're saying, a lot of you guys will resonate with. A lot of the messages I got on that video yesterday were along these lines. They say, I'm thoroughly unimpressed with what we've gotten so far in the Icebrood Saga Champions. I agree that the idea is cool, that there's smarter use of asset and replayability. However, the missions themselves are a slog and a grind, and nowhere near rewarding enough to be worth the slog and the grind. Plus, the fiasco with the confusion about the timer and how nothing happened when the time ran out really made a bad impression. It's really damning that the bar didn't even max out. I think that's because even though enough people were engaging with the content, they were hoarding up the Crystal Bloom tokens rather than spending them, when spending them was the only way to progress the bar. It probably also didn't help that the tokens were, on top of all of this, time-gated, unlike any previous iteration of the Boss Rush event model. In any case, the fact that the event essentially failed is really not a good look. Now, I'm going to pause the comment there for now to talk about this. So I did have an idea to talk a lot more about this element of the patch in yesterday's video, but we ended up getting a bit long. Anyone that didn't really participate or play in it, they did the boss event rush thing, where there was a global event going on across the entire game population, and the idea was if enough players interact with this element of the game, it's been fractals in the past, or world bosses or some, this time it was the dragon response missions, the new hotness. As enough people did it, it would push this bar up, you'd get extra rewards. Now, this whole thing basically failed and didn't work out here. And it's funny because I didn't really follow the bar at all in this patch. Not even for all the positive things I said about this new format. The boss event side of it really was totally ignorable to me, and I don't really think I get much enjoyment out of it. I had a very brief comment in yesterday's video to this effect. But basically, what gets to me about it is, generally speaking, we know that the bar is calibrated that they have expectations and metrics of how much they think players will interact with a thing, and they're pretty accurate about those metrics a lot of the time. So you kind of know that the numbers have been crunched, it's been accounted for, and it's probably going to succeed. So get your little participation in there, so you'll get your participation award, and generally speaking, it's gonna work out. So where's the fun? Where's the challenge? It's not a real question, will we make it or not? And then along comes this patch, and as you say, well, it really wasn't a good look. So as much as I applauded yesterday the format of Dragon Response missions, I don't think this is something they should take forward, indeed. Also, they say this whole release so far was a wash at best. I'm only being very generous here because I'm aware this is only the first quarter of it, and it's not entirely fair to condemn the entire episode quite yet. All right, well, let me pause you there again. I don't think that this is smart, honestly. I think you're giving the patch too much leeway. If you feel that you should be harsher and could be harsh about it right now, but you're not on these grounds, I think you're wrong to. I think you should weigh your full force of critique on it. Because the fact is, yeah, though they've branded it as quarter of the finale release, that doesn't excuse it for not being a full release. When the scheduling of these episodes coming out, it's taking the slots of full releases. You know, to view things your way is to hand-wave the fact that we're essentially getting the amount of content and development for the game quartered over the next, like, well over half a year. And that's a lot to stomach. Now, like I said, I'm all for them easing back, finding compromise, finding efficiencies for the main game right now to really focus on the expansion. I'm all for that. But there is a degree of severity here, and I think that is over the line. It's also kind of hard for me even to say any of that about compromise, when again, I look at the release of Path of Fire. What I have said, and continue to say, was the golden age of Guild Wars 2, where we had all of these patches for the living world that did not feel compromised whatsoever, and then suddenly, there was an expansion on our hands. I remember flying out to the studio and learning about Path of Fire and getting all that elite spec information and preparing my post-show and everything about mounts and all that stuff. And it wasn't just Path of Fire I was learning about. That event was a twinned event with Episode 6, Siren's Landing. A good deal of time was spent on that, because not only wasn't Path of Fire announced or any of that kind of stuff to the community, we hadn't even finished that season. Episode 6 wasn't a quarter of a release, and Episode 6 was coming pretty quickly after Episode 5 as well. Episode 6 was this huge thing. So, again, I really don't like the idea that we're getting quarter releases for, like, over half a year here. I want this to feel on its own like a full release. I don't care if you're calling it part of a finale. It needs to be bulked out more, and that's what I said yesterday. I want more quantity. I think the format is great, but we need more of this stuff. I saw another one of the comments in the video yesterday, someone calling these a slog and a grind. And I think criticisms like that get alleviated as well when we have more breadth to the patch, when there are more Dragon Response missions that are more divergent from one another. So it doesn't feel grindy and you've got that choice of which ones you want to tackle. Going back to this idea of how good things were leading into Path of Fire, I do want to point out we're kind of in a very different world with Guild Wars 2 development than we were as POF was coming out. It really strikes me that the whole studio was gung-hoing on Guild Wars 2 right around the POF launch. This might have been even something that caused their secondary or even tertiary projects to stall and slow, as we saw they had all of those issues. Nowadays, after the layoffs, we don't know how much manpower the main Guild Wars 2 really has. The suggestion was, I think, for most of us, that the vast majority of them would be on it. But as always, this stuff's cloudy. I saw a post about Glassdoor on Guild Wars 2 for Reddit just the other day. Now, I always knew Glassdoor as like a company review site. You know, it's like TripAdvisor but for places of employment. Once you're done being employed at a place, you review it, and new perspectives to that company can read how you took it. And you've got to remember that there's going to be this general negative bias most of the time with Glassdoor, because they are, after all, ex-employees that get to exercise full candor. That's what I knew Glassdoor as, but I guess there was an actual job posting there, a hiring going on, and it was for the new Guild Wars 2 game director, as of course our game director kind of dipped out very quietly behind the scenes several months ago now. And on this post, I don't know whether maybe the real facts are obscured on Glassdoor or what, but on this post it said that the Guild Wars 2 team was 10 to 50 people in size. 10 to 50. Now, what does that mean? Well, I don't think that means there's 10 to 50 working on the game entirely. I think there's probably a lot of people that are working on the next X-Pack, but that might not fall under the game director's direct purview. I think, and I'm just guessing here, that we might be looking at living world numbers on that one, 10 to 50. And now the size of this patch starts to make a little bit more sense to me. So anyway, back to your comment. You have one final section in which you say, perhaps once the full episode is out and all comes together, it will be a good episode in hindsight, but right now it's miserable and unimpressive. Easily the most disappointing flop of a release since I started playing, or since about July 2018. I don't mind the lack of a new map, and I actually think that going back to core areas and even some previous season areas is pretty cool. The expansion better be worth it, because if more of this is all we can expect until then, Reddit's going to be a miserable place to be, far more than it ever has been. Well, on Reddit, I would be careful of generalizing against the Reddit. There's really no point. Reddit is the least stable institution of the community. It's just a populist place that follows the current trend. Because of the way that upvoting works and strong sentiment is expressed on that website, Reddit is just going to flip from one way to the other on the slightest whim. If things are a little bit bad for the game, then Reddit will amplify it and make it look like it's very bad for the game. If things are generally okay for the game, Reddit will make the game look like it's the best thing since sliced bread. It will go left, it will go right, and it doesn't really matter. If you're looking for enthusiastic and interesting Guild Wars 2 discussion, I would suggest you just widen your base a little beyond just Reddit. You know, I put a screenshot in yesterday's video about a particularly negative thread, and someone was calling the community out for how negative they were being, and I read all this discussion on that. I'm honestly so exasperated by it because I feel like I'm in a time loop. There's nothing special or unique or interesting about the current state of the Reddit. By my counting, this is maybe the 6th or 7th, and that's not an exaggeration, phase of heavy negativity on the Reddit. It will then pass away after a while, and then it will come back after a while, and we'll have the same thread again and again and again. It is very, very weird covering and focusing on this one franchise for this length of time as I have done, because it makes you see how short-sighted and just pointless most of the discussion is. To your other note about most disappointing release, I would actually say the most disappointing release, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible here, but to my memory, if we're not counting many of the Season 1 releases, which really irked people. Like, I still remember the old YouTuber Don Tane doing a very angry and upset video about the quality of one of the South Sun releases, whereby we kind of went back to the Lost Shores, but the devs didn't really add too much more than just developing the story a bit. Living World Season 1 aside, because I'm a little hazy on some of those, I think probably it was the Mordrum event right before Heart of Thorns. You know, we'd had a content drought, a proper content drought, coming out of the end of Season 2, where they're scrambling to get the expansion going, and then this Mordrum event comes out. I compare that in a lot of ways to this, but the Dragon response missions and what they've done here are still leagues and leagues and leagues better than that. That is by far, and we've got a big difference in quality between the two, the worst release. And that was a long time ago though, so I think a lot of people are forgetting about it. Shallow comment chain here from Toast Baron, who says, regarding the lack of a cataclysmic event when Prime Orders awoke, I don't actually think he's awake yet. I think these events may just be stirrings. Jormag did say when Prime Orders awakens, it won't be the same grace as I, so I think he's technically still asleep. Q-Ride says, that's what I think too. I think us managing to defend against the destroyers at first, new missions coming out being progressively harder, and then us being overwhelmed and drowning in destroyers when Prime Orders explosively awakens, works just as well narratively to establish him as a threat than if we were struggling against him straight away. I agree. I think I was wrong in yesterday's video, and I wish I could take it back. See, with all the voice acting in the game now as well, I've gone back and played through Jormag Rising, did all the Bangar conversations in-game at the Eye of the North. By the way, did anyone notice how peculiarly that experience of loading in and out of the scrying pool to advance the conversation again and again and again, because originally when it released it was staggered into the game over time, is exactly, beat for beat, identical to the Kieran and Gwen love story progression in the Hearts of the North Guild Wars 1 stuff. Now, I know I just said a bunch of gobbledygook to a good chunk of you guys listening in the comments, but think about it. Anyone who played that Guild Wars 1 stuff, it's the exact same thing. It's the same experience loading in and out of an instance, like game engine-wise, it's the same thing. Experience-wise, location-wise in the lore, it's the same experience. Was this intended by the devs? Obviously, it's much better in Guild Wars 2 and about much more interesting subject material. No, hey, I couldn't help but notice that. Anyway, doing those, you know, these are the real hints about where the Prime Orders side of the story is coming from. In yesterday's video, I kind of suggested that the majority of suggestions about Prime Orders attacking were out of the game, and I was wrong to do that, because really, if you're doing these Bangar conversations, and yeah, they are a bit of a sidebar, and they are a bit buried away, it leads into it quite well. I do think it's abrupt, and I do hope that the Ice Brood Saga's ambition is only to give us a taste of Primordus rather than the whole meal, but it does work, and I wish I could take that back, and I wish I could take it back, this thing about him waking up as well, because yeah, I do think he's kind of still asleep, and he's stirring, and if we look at it that way, again, this is the same as the Eye of the North story, right? He wasn't really awake in Eye of the North, but his destroyers were rumbling, earthquakes were occurring. We're basically having that same story of when the earthquakes struck Lion's Arch and Kaineng Center and Istan over again. I would say in Guild Wars 1, he did a little bit more damage. You know, he affected these major population centers in a more tangible way and kind of actually scarred the landscape a bit, even while stirring as asleep. But yeah, I like that idea, and I want to take back what I said yesterday. I think I was completely wrong. I think Primordus isn't awoke. We're just on the cusp of something, and this is really good too, because Jormag is all about manipulating us and, you know, persuading us to do the things we really want to do when they align with her own ambitions. And the fear of Primordus is something more interesting for her to play with than the reality of Primordus. Also, you had that great line in the Bangar conversations about how she's actually scared of something, right? And they say, oh, what's she actually scared of? Genuinely, legitimately afraid. And Bangar says, oh, she won't tell you. And then later we find out Primordus is about to wake. I think she really is afraid of him. And so, yeah, I think it's better for us to hang on this note here. We'll see what happens in the later Dragon response missions, though. Next, we have Vesemir. Is this a Witcher reference? I've always wanted to ask that. Isn't there a character very similarly named to that in The Witcher? Yes, big Path of Fire review would be so epic. I'm so curious as to what you think about the Path of Fire raids compared to Heart of Thorns. And what is your general stance on both expansions? Since, in my opinion, after Season 4, is that Heart of Thorns was better, but I just wasn't there. Just the content of Heart of Thorns is so much more repeatable and engaging than Path of Fire when it comes to open world. And Sin says, I mean, most of the POF raids aren't half bad. SH, Doom, Lagos, and Kadim are responsible for a lot of amazing memories. I guess the only issue I take with them is that A, the filler events like Rainbow Road, The Gate, the rest of Wing 7 was so prevalent, and that B, there simply wasn't enough of them to keep the community from being in a perpetual state of doubt. If the big question of every raid release is, will this be the last raid, or do we have to wait a year and a half, then I don't have to tell you what it does to the community. Well, to all this raiding stuff, first of all, I do consider raiding more as a sidebar. Raiding would not get much discussion or look in the Path of Fire review. There's barely any raiders for the full game. There's barely ever been any raiders for the full game. The devs have always treated it as a sidebar themselves and been easing off rather than easing on. In the review, I would probably dedicate a part to, like, the idea of repeatable endgame, and that would cover stuff like fractals, possibly the state of Path of Fire's open world replayability, and then raids would be in there as well. I do think that quality and spectacle-wise, the raids from this era of the game have been really good, but again, they're just more of a sidebar. Also, a lot of this stuff that Sinstar says is not relevant just to Path of Fire. If the big question of every raid release is, will this be the last raid, then there's going to be a lot of perpetual doubt. That's not Path of Fire. That's always. There has never been a golden age of raiding. Yes, in retrospect, you can look at the first 4 wings or so and say, oh, these came out pretty close to one another, and these were a pretty good balance for the community's abilities at the time. You can say that, and we can now call that the golden age, but to go back and live in the golden age, it's just a lot of whining from the casuals that the devs are focusing on raids instead of their stuff, and it's a lot of doubt from the people who are in that part of the community, whether it's being delivered fast enough, and we're having enough, and whether the devs will focus on it. There has never been a time, ever, in Guild Wars 2, where endgame PvEers have felt catered to and been happy. Never. And that ship sailed, I think, when they went with Living World Season 1 instead of focusing on dungeons, and especially, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, coincidentally, after the Aether Path came out and the fallout from that. Anyway, going back to the idea of the big review, yeah, I have been plotting it out, and I've been thinking about where I would like to put different topics. It's a weird one because Heart of Thorns had this very wide base for the different things it was trying to do. It did a lot with guild systems. It introduced the mastery system. It introduced elite specializations. Path of Fire, when I really pen everything down, was very hyper-focused on the features that it went for. So I think that would be one of the big discussions. One of the other big discussions would be this yin and yang of Heart of Thorns and POF, because I very much view, at least for Path of Fire's own content on its own maps, it is a knee-jerk reaction away from HOT. And I think one of the big arguments I'd be putting forwards in this review is the fact that people complained and hated Heart of Thorns. You say here, oh, Heart of Thorns was the better expansion. My God, the incessant whining during the Heart of Thorns era about how people didn't want to be tied to these map timers to be able to have their enjoyment, and they hated how much was loaded onto the metas. I remember defending it at the time, and I personally am a fan of the way that Heart of Thorns worked, and I saw the replayability that was there, and I saw how intelligently they'd put the map currencies and stuff around. Path of Fire says, no, we're not going to do any of that because people complained about it, and it's the opposite direction. You get complete freedom to pretty much engage on whatever you want, and a lot of the emphasis is not on metas and not on repeatables, and we never really had that sense of it being structured long-term as well as HOT was. So, yeah, that's what a lot of the review would be about, and then it would be, you know, wondering what happens with End of Dragons after that. I've done a lot of mapping out about the idea of the review, but I'm getting a bit stuck as well on how the hell I include Icebrood Saga and Season 4. Because on the one hand, they are the Path of Fire era, and they deserve their own conversation, and the weakness of the POF open world map repeatability, for example, is maybe not something you can view in isolation, because they were, at the end of the day, about to drop Istan in, and they wanted people to be in that map. You know, Guild Wars 2 is so big with so many maps, the dream of having all players in all maps all the time sailed a long time ago. What they're really wanting to do is shunt you into the new experiences, and that's what they've effectively done through all of Icebrood Saga and all of Living World Season 4. But also, I feel like these things deserve their own mega reviews. I don't know, it's hard to figure out how I'd want to package them out. I don't want to do a mega review on Season 4, and I don't want to do a mega review on the Icebrood Saga. I mean, hell, I couldn't even do that one because it's not finished right now. But I also don't want to handwave them, and they're pretty integral to POF's own design. So I don't know, it's a fun one, but I'm in very, very early stages, and whether I take it further, I'm not sure yet. I do have so many other things I want to do as well. Hell, it's the end of November. I want it to be in Morrowind about now. Victor says, I'm glad they're reusing old maps. I was starting to get a WoW vibe out of Guild Wars 2, where there's an infinite amount of maps, but no one on them anymore. Getting maps for getting maps without being somewhat useful is a waste of resources who could be more useful elsewhere. The devs wouldn't have any need to revamp old maps if no one's visiting these anymore. However, I think the devs could go a bit deeper in their map reuse, like definitely modifying the vanilla and old Living World maps if they're reusing them in future Living World stories. The Doric Lake, Ember Bay, and Bloodstone Fen are amazing maps, but nowadays, these are fairly empty. Yes, I believe that the reuse of old maps, resurrecting them, is meaningful. One of the big arguments I've always made for the re-implementation of Season 1 is that a lot of the experiences people had in Season 1 are so old now that I don't care if you've played it before. It would feel fresh to go back and experience. You know, if the content itself is high enough quality, and I admit for a lot of the Season 1 stuff, it's not high enough quality. I think the Scrying Pool release this year actually proved that much. But a lot of it will feel fresh because you haven't done it for so long and you haven't been allowed to do it. To a certain extent, that argument works even for core stuff, and especially Season 3 maps. These places, you know, if you don't have a reward incentive to go for, you might not have been to them for ages. Like, I spent that time playing as a scrapper in a recent video on Draconis Mons, and, you know, the map felt pretty fresh to me, even though Draconis Mons is a map I grinded a lot on when going for that season's Ascended Trinket. Draconis Mons I had to get so much more playtime out of than any of the others, and yet here I am in 2020 playing it pretty fresh-faced. So yeah, if we get some kind of update to like Lake Doric or whatever, it'd be brilliant. Lake Doric's a really fun one as well. One of my favorite things about Lake Doric as an actual environment is, obviously, we go there in the story right after the dam has been busted, so all the lakes have drained out. And if you actually look very carefully at the map, you can see it's rather well made for the idea of there being a proper water level there. And I've always loved the idea of seeing Lake Doric, like, just a few hours before we actually do in-game. Before the dam is burst and the water level's still high, and you see these docks actually properly in use, and, like, that little resort area in one of the towns actually in use. That'd be great. And I don't know whether Dragon response missions in 2020 can put themselves in Lake Doric and give us a version with the water level, but it'd be insanely cool to see. I mean, it's been a few years now. Surely that dam has been repaired by now. There's a thing with Guild Wars 2. Now, I kind of got to grips a little bit of this when I was using Tyria 3D and data mining a little bit, where if they do a new version of a map where there's some kind of geometry change, they kind of then have to load 2 full versions of that map into the game's files. And, like, it's really heavy and it's not something they want to do much. And you could see in the early days of Season 1, all these different versions of Keswick's hills that's just slightly different. I think they're limited in some ways, or they have to be very clever and careful about what kind of physical assets they add to a map. Now again, data mining has shown, versions of Bloodtide Coast with all this ice on it. So if they do these big radical changes, not just, fire everywhere or whatever, there's something really great we could get out of this. When I look at a lot of my favorite gaming experiences and updates to games outside of Guild Wars, what the devs are often doing is they have a very keen understanding of their product, and they like cross-pollinate the new additions of the game to interact in fun ways with old stuff. And Guild Wars feels like it never does that in Guild Wars 2. You never really get a new update that also, in an interesting and dynamic way, has affected A, B, C, and D from earlier on. They keep things very separate. So, and I miss that from Guild Wars 2. So seeing that in this release, or these upcoming ones, will do a lot. Jay has a comment I'm getting major deja vu from, says, boy, this really feels like they could have brought Zodja back here. I legit have no idea what they're waiting for, not bringing her back. Well, my assumption has been that they're not bringing Zodja back for small release stories. You notice they only ever really did that once, and that was Heart of Thorns. Zodja had barely any lines in Heart of Thorns, but they did go to the effort of getting Felicia Day to record a tiny bit in the studio. Now, my suggestion here is that maybe due to real-world considerations or whatever with the voice artist, that perhaps they don't want to bring her back for just a couple of little sporadic lines. Maybe she's not local, maybe it's not possible for her or whatever. When they next bring her back, they want to give her a huge bulk of stuff to do, so it feels really worthwhile, and she can probably get invested in the character and remember what's going on and all that kind of stuff. Maybe. And maybe even while they're at it, because this has been, this limbo for so long, they might even end up killing the character off. And everything I'm saying here makes a lot of sense if you believe that one day there will be an expansion to do with the depths of Tyria and a war against Primordus, heavily involving the dwarves and the Asura. And of course, then you could have Zodja. And weirdly enough, I've been hot and cold on Taimi for so long, but now I really like the idea of a long story with plenty of interaction between these two characters. Because in lore, both Zodja and Taimi are kind of like related in a lot of ways and have got a lot of common ground, a lot of shared history and things to talk about. And we just never have got to glimpse any of it. So having a lot of that in an expansion, I think it actually does excite me a little bit. So that's always been my thinking. Fast forward now today though, and there's a very real risk, and I do use the word risk with all of its meaning, that they might be about to kill Primordus off, and that we won't ever get that kind of expansion, that they're doing it all here. Suddenly it's like, well, they really should bring Zodja back. They really should do big things with Zodja now. A patch like this, the Destroyers, against on Ratasum's doorstep, and yet nothing. It might all just be a sign of how strained and hardworking a limited crew is, IRL, on getting these releases out to us, and it means that extra cool stuff like getting Zodja back is just out of their grasp right now, and maybe they know that the community is so burned out on wondering this question that they can kind of not worry about it themselves anymore. There are, of course, other techniques. Zodja could have been around. She could have been there, but just not voice acted. But you run into this problem, I think, where, as I complimented so much yesterday, the Dragon Response missions have a lot of dialogue going on. And the dialogue, in general, doesn't get in the way of the gameplay. That's one of the best strengths of this format here, that there is so much dialogue and intrigue going on. So now imagine this. You've got some kind of patch where Rat assumes attacked, imminent danger from the Destroyers. Zodja is established to be there, though she's not voice acted, and we talked to her a bit. People are going to wonder, well, why doesn't she come with us on these Dragon Response missions? And then if you try to put her in the Dragon Response mission, there's an expectation of a lot of dialogue, voice-acted dialogue. If it's not voice-acted, it's going to interrupt the flow, and, maybe it's just unworkable. But yeah, Zodja would have been a good idea. I hope to see her if they're really doing something big with Primordus on this one. Or they do the coolest thing, which is leave Primordus for later. And finally, we have a question here from Ashley, who says, thank you for sharing your thoughts on PvP. It speaks volumes when even you aren't even into the current state of the game type. I can't believe the devs made drastic changes with little to no follow-up balance. I guess I'll have to wait until the X-Pack and the new Elite specs for them to go back and address the balance. Well, as far as I remember, am I imagining this? Wasn't there something somewhat along those lines said that, maybe if new Elite specs are being developed, and we heard in the stream that's basically true, that big balance might be waiting because they're thinking a lot about those and how they slot in and stuff like that, so maybe. I don't think all the balance changes were necessarily bad, by the way. I really don't. I like what happened, it seems, at least from what I've played. of the removal of big damage from big CCs. Stuff like Rampage feels a lot more balanced and calibrated now. I played a good amount of warrior games, and you can still hit pretty hard with one of those Rampage skills. You can still drop out of it into a very quick greatsword burst while they're still stunned, stuff like that. There are still interactions, it just feels way less cheesy now. I think that then after that, they've made some head-scratcher decisions that look really weird. Like, for example, the Hollow build in vogue at the moment is a grenade build using explosives, which, guess what, gives you damage on CC. There's flashbang trait, which gives you a good extra packet of explosive damage after a dodge roll and when combat starts. And hey, we'll make it days at the same time. So, you know, you're back to square one, Arena if you're doing stuff like that. I also think that the Condi changes, in general, feel pretty good. Now, it's killed a lot of the Condi builds that I enjoyed playing, but generally I felt like the Condi builds were kind of unhealthy and unfun to play against. But I think that's really the biggest contributor to how tanky I feel now. I had so many experiences coming back to it 2 weeks ago, where I would get bombed with Condias and thinking, well, I've got no cleanse, I'm dead for sure, and then they actually fall off of me, and I'm actually okay, and I'm surviving these situations that I never in a million years would have expected to before. I think that's good, because stuff like Sigil of Cleansing being non-negotiable kind of sucked in the past, and I still sort of feel like Sigil of Cleansing is non-negotiable, but I feel like there's steps in the right direction. And tankier combat too, let's talk about that. I don't actually have a problem with slowing the pace down. I actually think a slower pace is really good for the spectatability of the game. I think it's really good for emphasizing the strategic decisions we make in rotations, which is a big part of Conquest and something I really enjoy. And I think also, perhaps most importantly of all, it's really good for evening out the learning curve of the game and hopefully get some fresh blood in. Instead of people dying so quick while they're still trying to look at their skill bar and figure out what they can even do, they've now got a little bit more time and a little bit more back and forth on the average to do things and, you know, extract where the joy is in that game, and then actually maybe we get some people. I do think the game was too fast before, and I think slowing it down's a good idea. I think slowing it down even further might be a good idea, but the crucial point here is, if you're going to slow it down and make things tankier, so to speak, there has to be a sense of momentum. There has to be a sense that that even though the fight is taking longer, it is always progressing to an end. That you do feel like over time, one of you will win no matter what happens. Things aren't stalling, they've just slowed down. Now that is the bit that ArenaNet's tripped up on, and that is what's so crucial. I don't want to be in some like 3-minute long 1v1 where it feels like there's no end in sight. If I'm in a 3-minute long 1v1 and I know this is going to end with one of us killing the other one and we're just slowly working down to it, and the guy that is more precise and more accurate over time will be the winner. Now that's a lot of tension, that's a lot of excitement, and again, that does a lot of things for Conquest as a game type. A lot of the builds don't feel like that. And it's not just 1v1s, it's with the team fights too. A lot of that in thanks to the new Shout Warhorn build, which, by the way, I remember the really powerful Warhorn stuff in Shout Hills and stuff. I did actually play a little bit before I quit. It was right before then I played it. I felt like it was very strong, and hey, I come back and see all the warriors are running around with Warhorns now, or most of them. And then we have the fact that they just feel unfun altogether. I really think the most unfun build out there is the Jarlis, Karla, Revenant build. I would love to see a nerf on that. Though, again, I think they might not do it because, you know, when has that build really had its time in the sun? And at least it feels different to some of the other metas that stalled for a long time. You know, one of the best ways I really think that ArenaNet could have been balancing Guild Wars 2 through the POF era, and they may well take this advice and do this for the End of Dragons era. This is kind of controversial to say and not something any idealist would go for, but it's kind of what they did with this Rev thing, is be like Blizzard. Just force a meta of one kind or another, and then force a new one within some kind of decent timescale. 6 months, 9 months, somewhere around that, as people are getting tired of seeing the same Renegade build over and over again, or the same Condi Mirage, or the same overly stealth-heavy Deadeye, or whatever your pet peeve is. After 6 to 9 months, force a new meta. Shuffle the amulets around in a dramatic way. Shuffle the Grandmaster potencies around in a dramatic way. Some of the weapon skills in a dramatic way. Do a lot of them at once. It's a grab bag. Something completely new emerges and develops. People have fun with it, and then shift it again later. It's folly, I would say, to go for this idea of perfect, true balance where everything is absolutely in touch with everything else. And if it's folly today, it's definitely folly by the time End of Dragons comes out, and there's another wave of elite specs to go out on top, which you know have to be strong at least to help sell the expansion, so the first year or so is going to be completely thrown out the window for metas anyway. We already are in this situation where anything fun and interesting and balanced gets tossed aside because of a new wave of elite specs, so lean into it, embrace it, and then maybe I think there could be something good and something entertaining too. At least tournaments month on month would end up feeling a little bit more different. But hey, ArenaNet have not really adopted that as their style. I know some people with the staff change you mentioned in your comment were kind of hoping for a new era of interesting balance with Guild Wars. I'm not seeing it, and I don't really have much faith in it. So, unfortunately, we're half an hour in here. I had a ton more responses I wanted to get to, but I guess I'll leave that there for the floor. If you guys have further comment, criticism, interesting ideas, topics for conversation, please leave them down below, and keep your eye out for the next part very soon. I actually had a ton of questions about VR from the previous part of the floor, and I think I'll dedicate a topic to that as well. I know a lot of you only listen to me for Guild Wars stuff, and today we talked exclusively about Guild Wars, but it's been something I was really looking at recently, so we'll see. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great morning. See you next time.